Večer, pane and pánové. Welcome again to the Czech Villa, home of the U.S. Ambassador to the Czech Republic. My name is Joanne Lockard. I'm the Counselor for Public Affairs, and it is my honor to welcome all of you, as well as Mr. James Ragan here for the 7th time, I believe. We are very happy to host you again, and I hope you will all enjoy this wonderful evening of American and Czech cultural exchange. Right now, I'd like to pass the microphone to the U.S. Ambassador to the Czech Republic, the Honorable Stephen King.
Dobrý večer, dámy a pánové. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the home of the United States Ambassador. I know that a number of you have been here before, for an evening of poetry with Mr. James Ragan. He said I can call him Jim, so I'll call him Jim. A famous American poet with Czechoslovakian roots. He's an American ambassador of poetry, an accomplished playwright, and having read to audiences all over the world. For example, in 1985, he was one of 3 Americans, along with Robert Bly and Bob Dylan, who were invited to perform at the first International Poetry Festival in Moscow. He's also read to Czech Presidents Václav Havel and Václav Klaus. Jim is the recipient of numerous poetry honors, including the Emerson Poetry Prize and the Poetry Society of America's Gertrude Clayton Award. In addition, he is an outstanding teacher, serving for over 2 decades, that is over 20 years, as the director of the University of Southern California's professional writing program. This is not the first time. In fact, I think, as Joanne has mentioned, I think this is maybe the 7th time that Jim will have read his poetry here at the American Ambassador's residence. He returns annually to teach a writing program at Charles University and write screenplays and poetry from the balcony of President Havel's old apartment, looking out on the Vltava, he tells me. So therefore, unsurprisingly, Prague has become a source of inspiration for his poems. For example, The Hunger Wall, The Jewish Cemetery, and the Charles Bridge have been portrayed in his poems, along with Humana in eastern Slovakia, where his family actually comes from. I'd like to thank Jim for his willingness to come back once again and share with us your latest poetry. I hope you all enjoy the evening, and I will turn the floor over to our guest of honor, Jim Ragan.
Thank you very much, Ambassador King, and many friends here I see in the audience. So I want to thank you for coming today, and want to also thank Helena Wagnerova for helping to arrange this evening from the beginning, as well as the whole staff in the protocol offices. I really appreciate the introduction. I do, because it brings me back to memories of my travels to my villages in Slovakia, but also to here, since I had relatives from Czech and Slovakia, and so Havel used to call me the true Czechoslovak, which was always his compliment. But I must tell you this also, I am one of 13 children. Now, some of you have heard me tell this anecdote before. Being one of 13 children, I was always kidded about the fact that, being the 12th, it doesn't, that I had brown eyes. So, and everyone else had blue eyes and blonde hair. And so I had the anecdote about the young couple who had 5 children, all of whom had brown eyes, or blue eyes and blonde hair, but the 6th child had brown eyes and brown hair, and the husband comes to to the wife and says, "Is this sixth child truly mine?" And she says, "Yes, of course it is. Trust me." And 20 years he comes back and says, "Tell me the truth. Is this sixth child really mine?" And she says, "Darling, of course. 50 years. We've been married 50 years. Of course it's your child." Now, she's on her deathbed. He comes back and says, "You're about to meet your maker. Tell me the truth. Is the sixth child truly mine?" She says, "Yes, darling, it is. The other 5 are not." Now, now that was what I went through in my family, who would always convince me I was really not part of the family. But it also gave me a sense of belonging, a wonderful close family. My dad also had the anecdote he liked to tell, and I always do in my reading. Some of you have heard this one too. I read this at the United Nations. They truly understood it. And that is simply that many Czech, Russian, Hungarian, Polish names have many consonants in them, very few vowels. And so I remember getting an applause even for that at the United Nations. Like, I understood that. My dad said we were children of consonants and misplaced vowels, right? So his anecdote was about the Czech immigrant who came to America. And he goes to an optometrist to check his eyes. The optometrist brings out a chart and says, can you read the 5th line on the chart? He says, "Read it, I know him." So this is why I like to write the kind of poetry where language disintegrates, where suddenly it diminishes, or at least there's a devolution with language. I remember being in China on a Fulbright fellowship, and one of the American advertisements we always had with Pepsi Cola is let Pepsi brings the Pepsi generation come alive, but they translated it as drink Pepsi and watch your ancestors come back from the grave. These were the kinds of things I know I went through as I traveled the world, with the poetry. But I'm fond of the idea that my first poem was actually a limerick, and it went something like this. There once was a man from Japan who wrote verses no one could scan. When told they were so, he said, "Yes, I know, but I always like to try to get as many syllables into the last line as I possibly can." So I started on a simple level, and I'm sure when you hear the poem, you'll think I'm still there. But poetry was my way. I studied pre-med. I thought I would be that. I taught at Caltech as poet in residence among these brilliant, wonderful mathematicians and all. But it was my time here in Prague. It was my meeting with Havel almost 25 years ago, when I had been a dissident here. I had been banned. I had to report to police stations. They even did a documentary on my life detailing a lot of this. And even here during the 1968 Russian invasion. And I always remember how Havel asked for a meeting in Los Angeles when he came to get an honorary doctorate, I think it was. And the first thing he did was put his hand out and said, "We are colleagues." And that's something you don't forget. Because even when I did a reading here, once he introduced me as an ambassador of the arts. And so they honored me by calling it the documentary that as well. So let me begin with a reading or two of some of the poems. And I should say this. I should do this off the top because I have dear friends. I want to, first of all, I'm going to read The Hunger Wall and dedicate it to Ambassador King and his wife, Karen, who cannot be here. I want to invite and read that. But I understand, is Ambassador Olsa here? Ambassador Olsa? Is he able to come? He's going to be the next consul general because my current consul general with his wife Katarina is here, and that is Pavel Shepelak in the back, former ambassador to Pakistan, many other countries. But I usually like to tell this because you have to understand, I know that also I like science fiction. Well, I was the subject of a little bit of science fiction with my mom because my sister had told her that I was studying for my doctorate. Well, she only heard one other thing. So I remember coming home once from university, and she had a good babushka-tied friend there who came, and my mother said, "Oh, this is my son Jimmy I always talk about. He's studying to be a doctor." Now, what do you do but cover for your mom? So the woman comes right up and says, "Oh, I have such pain right here in the back of my neck." Now, I learned a little bit about the fact that if you sleep high on the pillow, the mucus does not come down through the throat into the neck, and it could help with pain. So I said, sleep high on your pillow, and then take 2 aspirin. Next morning, she came back, and she said, "Oh, he's going to be such a great doctor. I feel so good already." And I now realized, oh my, I told my sister, "Ann, you have to tell Mom the truth. I can't break her heart." So she did. And my mother comes to me like this. You are going to be Herr Professor? That's higher than the doctors in Czechoslovakia. They teach the doctors. I had graduated from this to the top. So at least there was the science fiction portion of that I had to live out. But let me begin with the hunger wall and how I came to write that. It began with the fact that in Los Angeles at the time we had riots, which signified pretty much to me there was a widening abyss between the rich and the poor. And I came here about 6 months later to watch the 2 countries split, Slovakia from the Czech Republic. And I remember sitting at Lavka, looking out and seeing the hunger wall coming down to the Vltava River. And I asked the waitress, and she says, "Oh, that's the wall that Charles IV had the poor build just so he could pay them." Well, that fit right into what I wanted to write about, the idea of hunger, and how sometimes, unfortunately, we watch it very well. And there's the image of well several times in the poem, you'll hear it. But in writing this poem, it meant simply that we have to pay attention to the idea that we sometimes, as Goethe once said, it was actually Virgil, he says, every poem that should be written, that needs to be written, has already been written. And Goethe came back many years later and said, that's right, anything that should be written, that must be written, has already been written. But since no one reads it, we must write it again and again. And this is one of those poems. The Hunger Wall. After walking to the bridge at Karlova, we found the river where at dusk the swans dipped their beaks into the falls for sanctuary. The trees closed in for shade. We gazed through willows to the opposite hill, a single light from a room growing thick with sadness. Solemn smoke now cooked the evening meal. We were just about to treat our hunger well when, out of sunlight, undeclared, a shaded mass of stone began to stretch its neck along the slope. It would scan the water for a quarter hour before the foliage rubbed its throat, some internal hunger now assuaged. For only moments, then again, the impulse thumbed like whalebone on a drum. The poplars began to rustle. A hawk, spiraling like an aspen deep in chatter, betrayed its nest to block the sun. The dam below rose up to bolder water, as if to show how easily wars are won. They feed the hunger wall, the waitress points, the fingers in her skirt, rubbing coins, her hands are shoring up to feed the past. I don't want the poor to endure me, she said, King Charles said to those he paid, as he watched their faces building borders, hunger for a wall, as she faced the smoldering Vltava River, watching hunger well. Now, this is one of those poems where Shostakovich says, art destroys silence. And he wrote that, he wrote the 13th Symphony about Babi Yar, when so many people just discarded the fact that the Jews were killed and buried in the ravines outside Kiev. So sometimes you write the poem to make people, again, be aware of their surroundings. And hunger especially, something that I know we're always concerned about. Now, here's one that I wrote and read for several presidents and ambassadors, many, who, there's one line in here that they particularly like. I remember even when I read for the Bush family, they wanted a copy of this poem because of this one line. This is entitled, If for Each of Us, and it was, again, with all my travels, my goal has always been to move the minds of kings, ambassadors, presidents, whomever. I remember, again, devolution of language, reading the Soviet Weekly when we were in Moscow in '85. It said, there will be an exhibition of arts, 15,000 Soviet Republic painters and sculptors. These were executed over the past 2 years. Literally. So this poem deals with a need to get back to the simplicity. And when I was traveling, people say, aren't you exhausted by all of it? And I said, well, I came back from a reading I did for the South Korean premier, and I saw my son playing on the floor with blocks and making a castle and jumping knights over horses into the castle, and I remember getting down with him and getting into this simple little moment. And every time they'd say, would you live your life the same? I said, absolutely, I wouldn't change a thing. I'd repeat everything I did. If for each of us, a rope could swing us long and light across the widening trough of all that fails us in our lives, I would want to land upon the Isle of Echo, lush with repetition, green with being original in birth, and twice the twin a wave might dance along the scurry. I would want a canyon tall for hawks to carry long the deep tattoo of voices on the air. I would want an ear to hear what words to read again to memory, what verse to carol, thoughts to root. Before the sparrow's flight the mind has taken comes to rest on truth. I would want to hear a vowel repeat in consonance with alliteration's frothy throat. And should the landing fail its footing, I would want to know what inspiration in shorter flight one syllable might repeat, as in the swash the flat stone makes to skip across the light and water, or the voice the wind gives to birch and linden. I would want the distance to all understanding to narrow just enough to fail at failure. I would want a melody of chances to learn to love again what first I dreamed, free as wonder, soft as touch, and of all things simple, to care again for them as much. You heard the line, I know you did, because some of you went like that when I said, to fail at failure. This one I wrote for my father, who took me all over this country when he first came back on a train. A train became a library. He took me everywhere. So I'm reminded of how just looking out at this world, this beautiful country. I'm reminded of something Will Rogers says, there are 3 kinds of men. He says the ones that learn by reading, the few who learn by observation, and the rest of them have to pee on the electric fence and find out for themselves. That was me. I had to know it. I had to be there. So this is entitled Breath. It has an epigraph by Proust. Our arms and legs are full of sleeping memories of the past. Breath tugs the skin so hard in sleep, the limbs expand. As if we could sweep an arm out width and lengthwise along the furniture of a whole forest and call it in across the vast moon of a field or planet to our own small room. In the high trees of imagination, we tease ourselves to crawl to the top of a pine, inhale an aspen, stoke it in the sun, its sweet aroma roiling in the fragile air. And stepping down still in the dark of our own sleep's bed, we study the mind's way out. At night, in the wardroom practicing death, my father, with owed breath tucked in the bed of his lungs, learned the punctual notes of leaving, the dark that coal excels before the last grind of fire whittles it to space. A railroad man who took the world by Pullman, he knew the blissful pass of the river for miles and wood when night burned out, stow the moon's tall flame in ash. In memory of the dark, each splice of rusted rail and sagging boxcar. Breath is in the sleep of legs he saved for the mind's departure. I always enjoy reading that poem one more time. All right, now, this is a poem that I wrote after coming back from Moscow, after the very trip we did to read for Gorbachev. And I was at the airport at LAX. Could have happened at any airport. And I still remember waiting for the baggage to come down when down shot a book of poetry by Rilke. Rainer Maria Rilke came down onto the conveyor belt. And you can see all the people just looking at the baggage, and then there was the book. And then back to the baggage, and then there was the book. And the baggage, and the book. It must have fallen from someone's knapsack, but that book just took everybody's attention. And I remember in writing this poem how it dawned on me that this was probably the first time where most of these people were actually forced to acknowledge literature. So this is entitled Rilke on the Conveyor Belt at LAX. A rick of pages, it falls hardly noticed into motion. And down the track unspined, it cycles time between a rucksack and laundry. A book no thicker than a wallet or a comb is the unworthy carry-on, newly bought, colliding with a carpet bag or a steamer on the unlikely navigation into being where it's not. Each passenger has watched it circle more than once, a bold intrusion into the archipelago of things familiar. There's no fixed point of concentration, no laughter, no elation when the eyes dissect the slow descent of baggage into orbit. As if in taking up an arm strap, each handler slews a body to the spars of his shoulder. Had Rilke himself fallen, unbound, lying in the United States, he would have passed unnoticed by the baggage check or porter who failed to think it odd or such a pity to tag him at the lost and found. How many miles had his words trespassed? How many cities alive, unread among so many ports of authority? A gold leaf of art, so grand in the pall of memory, it gives the mind encouragement to survive. Unless, unsung like a soldier's duffel duty bound, fear spreads its tarp along the spine of language. Creation can end this way, abrupt or final, like travel to the ends of the world with no intent or vision, but destination. I had the difficult request to honor and did so when we had 17 Parkland students who were shot and killed in Florida 2 years ago. And they asked if I would come to meet with them, and I did. I got on the plane immediately, went down to read, to talk to them. And I wrote this poem actually before that. I wrote this poem for my brother and sister who had passed away 6 months apart. But it was a poem I read for them. And it moved them. And at that point, I still remember how the parents themselves were touched by it. And now we just had recently, as you all know, in El Paso and also in Dayton, Ohio, several more killings, senseless killings. So for those 17 souls lost there and the, I think now 29 others, I dedicate this poem. It's called A Good Sky. There always is one the next morning, rain or no rain. I show you a good sky. It could hold a fleet of geese above a kite, sipping in a breeze, or foliate the wind with leaves of cherry wood and hedge. It will blanket your sleep with mirrors of stars in the soft undressing of night. It will love you solely through the Venus dawn, rubbing your eyes awake the moment before the day's light hangs its spars. I show you a good sky It will rain its reflection on your one troubled eye, the one that blinks each time a hawk rants by. I am no one's romantic. No, I am the sky's shadow wish, writing this only to breathe its light. I shall show you a falling sun, passing like a lover to be near you, allowing no star or bulb on a corner lamp to possess you as you are. Look, here I am, the moon sky down. I will shave a horizon out of peaks like none your memory has ever carved. I show you a good sky. Its broad blue ribbon will wrap its mind around your eyes' imagination and tease you into smiles. Now, be patient. Let your grieving rest a while. You know, Martin Luther King once said, people fail to get along because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they have not community with each other. A good place to start. This one here has a little preface. When we went to Moscow, I performed this for Gorbachev, for the audience. You have to imagine 10,000 people in a hockey stadium looking up at the stage and going, oh my God, there's Bob Dylan. Seamus Haney, the Nobel Prize winner. Robert Bly. Who the hell is that? It's me. And I have to do a preface on this because when they had the reception afterward, there's an image of Rimbaud, the French poet, R-I-M-B-A-U-D. But this one Russian girl who was learning her English thought she heard Rambo. So she came to me and said, I really liked your poem about Sylvester Stallone. And I couldn't figure it out until I went, oh my God, Rambo. And the title is called The 10th People of Beverly Hills. Of course, I would have thought that too. So, but again, another example of miscommunication. This is a sign on the lobby of the Moscow Hotel. It's across from the Russian Orthodox cemetery, or monastery. And it said, you are welcome to visit the cemetery where famous Russian and Soviet composers, artists, and writers are buried daily, except Thursday. Well, the homeless are the faceless of the world, and they are buried daily. I remember they did for the magazine they sell. You see them selling magazines. They did an article on me and put me on the cover. I was coming back from Vienna from a reading I'd been doing down there, pulling my little drag case along, when I kept hearing, Mr. Ragan! Mr. Ragan! Then I saw him on the ground, and he's holding up the magazine like this, with my face on it. Walked into my class, and I said, I may not be famous or popular in the world, but the homeless love me. And this poem is at the shelter in Los Angeles, framed. It's called The 10th People of Beverly Hills. And this is the one that Dylan wanted for his son, Jacob, who was coming over to celebrate his 16th birthday in Georgia, where we were in Tbilisi. And to this day, I know where this original poem is. The son has it. But it won many awards. It's been anthologized a lot. The 10th People of Beverly Hills. Faceless, on the boulevard of mirrors, north along the flats of Rodeo Drive, stripped bald-head mannequins. They come treading on the fears of high fashion, tents on their backs, and on their cheeks the beach black tar of tasteless chic, as if to dress were not enough. We would have them wash our backhands slapped from their Rimbaud faces, and all through the wind whiskers and fishbones curdled by cream, they see along the deli box bins of fruit stalls of Wilshire Boulevard, the world in the room of their small walk space. They are never certain whether they are merely asked to fill a role like memory in some thoughtful dream of place, or live always short of major in some dying minor sort of way. As if to live were time enough, we would have them end beyond their means. Hours long they scrabble on the walls and mirrors the words they would like to leave us. The haunted prints of thought falls drifting out of mind's possession like nostalgia or grief. The world has lost its face. There are no hobo kings or pioneers late to live by. When they lie above the windy steam of sewer grates, dream still and all mind gone, they warm their body holes to sleep. They wake to be awake. In the dreams of many who never took the road to gypsy sorrow, breathing is enough. It is a mistake to feel themselves alone, to fill their sky holes up with dark. There has never been a need for crying, the dying always say. Once we move within the final inch of breath, there is no other. There are 1,000,000 tents in the universe with holes we mistake for stars. I see them on Wenceslas Square all over the city, on the bridge, everywhere. And I always give something in Beverly Hills where I live near there. I was on the bridge, Charles Bridge, and I didn't see one lying on the ground. And my son, who must have been 5 years old, came up and tugged at my pants and pointed, pulled out, I gave it to him, and he ran over. They're always watching you. They learn more from you when you don't know. This one, Waiting for the Bus at Midnight, was a poem that actually helped win the Emerson Poetry Prize. It was written in Morristown, New Jersey. Some of you might know the city right outside of New York. And I had been there waiting to go see my publisher in New York. At midnight it was. And trying to get into town when I saw a young couple from here to this divan right here. And they were just kissing and hugging. And my hair was a little longer at the time. And I still remember the romancing was getting a lot more passionate, and I kept moving in this direction. Now they were truly on that bench kissing, and it was just a matter of time, and I knew I had to move over here. He must have thought, well, you know, he's one of us, he won't mind. Well, I wrote the poem from an older voice, mature voice, who's looking at this and saying, he's doing this very badly. So the poem became Waiting for the Bus at Midnight. A lamppost of finger streams, the moon puffs a cloud past ghosts of autumn, slips down in a moment's queue and kicks its dusty shoes and muddy bottom, dry of the night seren. The act begins. A willow sags to the steps, kneeling where the town hall clock whispers sermons to the monk drunk with Sunday talk. Crickets lying in the mist settle to their pillows. Only the car wakes screaming as the dog wags its tail along the center stripe. Bitterns brag indifference to the star and teenage lead wearing slacks too tight and dreaming. Who sometimes when she tiptoes up to meet his tongue stretches worlds apart, her buttocks round, hypnotic. She does not hear my breathing, but her lips are lined so boldly like trams crippled by the cold, see the silhouette of forms at rest, yet do not hear the swoon that staggers in the sweat beneath her breast. I strain to watch the drama hands unfold and kiss her neck, its naked moles like speckled dunes or shadows stippled on the moon, while he, flipping a coin, heads or tails, saddles the bench like Brando, vacant, and overplays the role. They're coming right on time. Take him away. Now, if you've ever been rejected, this one, everyone here who is an artist of sorts has known rejection. And this is a rejection letter I got from Japan. You only hope you get a letter like this. But this is for those of you who are in the arts or not, or as ambassadors, understand it as well too. And here's the rejection letter. We read your work with inexpressible pleasure. We swear on the sacred memory of our ancestors that we have never before encountered such a masterpiece. If we publish your admirable work, His Majesty the Emperor will undoubtedly insist on its being a model for all future writing, and will forbid our publishing any work inferior to yours. Since talents like yours emerged only once in every 1,000 years, this would put us out of business. And we must therefore refuse your divine work and deposited at your feet, trembling at the thought of the severe judgment we shall receive from the future generations for failing to include in our pages work of such dear genius. I could accept that rejection. Flannery O'Connor was once asked, do universities stifle writers? And she said, in my opinion, they don't stifle enough of them. Many of bestseller could have been prevented by a good teacher. Well, this I'm dedicating to Pavel and to Katerina, and Michael, I think, is here as well, as one also who is attempting to push the arts as much as they can, as Ambassador King is as well, by having me here. This is called Hitchhiking to the Arctic, and Albert Einstein was fond of saying imagination is more important than intelligence. And so I would like to dedicate this to all of you, because just when you think you're finished with a project or finished with a book or finished with that dance or finished with this film, there's still a distance to go. Hitchhiking to the Arctic, it's about solitude. Any ice floe will do, but give it a name. The Paternoster for a start, or the Isle of Latitudes drifting north of Iceland out of Hudson Bay and seas as mixed as the Bering Strait. Choose the ice that's narrowed at each end, the melting equal in duration. Your little nation's future dependent on the center clearing any final reef the change of wind might make. And deny any possibility that you're drifting, sunless and alone, that you're deranged, confused by the solo berm on the map you yourself have sown. And deny above all else the albatross, whose wings you sheared as windshields to the eyes. You have a great distance of trust to cross, so little of it bearing on a compass or a star. You have only the dream of being lost a certainty, that in the silence of the mouths there will come a conversation only you will hear. In that vast indifference of the ice that drops its continents an inch each year, you will survive on solitude, each day or night, when even the moon your eyes betray grows darker as you grow, and all around you dance the petals of the sun burning in the cold blue of snow. The light that draws you nearer is further than you know. That's a tough last line. And I get enjoyment. I'll do two more. Is that okay? We on time? This one I dedicate to my daughters. Those of you who have daughters, you know how they own you. Well, mine do. They totally own me. They're doing so well. And my son also, very generous. I wrote this poem here in Prague about my daughters as I looked at them on the opposite Charles Bridge, and how different they were and yet how similar they were. And I personally have no cynicism in the modern world. I don't believe in it. I believe that there's much to be done. There's no time for that. And my daughters prove it to me every day. They let me know the power of dreams, the power of looking at your world, power of astonishment. This is entitled The Astonishment of Living. I saw beneath the spreading elm 2 talking girls weaving rainbows in their eyes. I saw their lives on opposite shores of the river yield up their buckets to the falls. Every drop was bathed in the fragrant shawls of eglantine. Every leaf in wind rising up to comb each branch sent a whisper out along the slope. Let go. Let go the breath in rain and every strand of light in fog. Let go of the tongue's crow until it sings along with rocks and runnels as if it were divine. Let go of honored sky and earth. Let go the horizon in between. Lose all the sunlit undulations of the season's wheat and sing. Sing out to seeds, to grass, to all that breathes into the pores of stones. Let go the sovereign moons of space, the celestial aureoles breathing out a planet and pulsing out its days. And where the stars ignite in showers, let them fall. Recite the moment's song that tomorrow wind will bring in squalls. Free the century's melody as you would a line or burden down a well. Allow the astonishment of living, one reed or willow feeding swallows through a hungry night until they weary of elation. Let all buckets fill, all loss be light. I saw two talking girls weaving rainbows in their eyes, and daughtering in me their dreams, I grew, astonished by all conception, by the frail grandeur of life. Now, this needs a good introduction. Most of you realize that when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, he did say, stepped onto the moon, he did say, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. But when he was leaving to go into the module to go up to the mothership, he said, "Good luck, Mr. Gorski." And no one knew what he meant. And they chased him down, the press chased him down. What did you mean by that phrase? And he wouldn't say anything. Apparently many years passed away, and I guess the Gorskis had also passed away. And they came back to him and asked him again, and he said, "Well, when I was younger, a child, I remember my Gorskis were neighbors, and I remember a ball rolling near their window, and as I went to pick it up, I heard Mrs. Gorski say to Mr. Gorski, 'Sex? You want sex? You'll get sex when the kid next door walks on the moon.'" Good luck, Mr. Gorski. Well, I taught at Caltech, as I said. They asked if I would write their anniversary, 100th anniversary poem for them, which I then did. And in my research, I came across Theodor von Karman. Now, Theodor von Karman gave us one of the most important scientific inventions of the 20th century, the wind tunnel. Without it, we could not leave gravity and get to the moon. So I wrote with him in mind in terms of dedicating the poem to him. And in my understanding of him, there at the Athenaeum, which is the faculty center at the Caltech, there's a wonderful painting of him and Einstein together, because Einstein taught there before he went off to Princeton to teach. And here, Charles University, he also taught. That's what makes me so proud to be there. So in any case, now Mr. Gorski is something in the past, but von Karman was Hungarian with a very thick accent. And most of you remember the Galloping Gertie. It's a bridge in Washington. The wind got hold of it, and people were running off. Dogs were running off, and finally, many of the cars just plummeted into Tacoma Narrows. And so they called von Karman and said, the governor said, "Would you tell us, what can we do?" We says, "Well, if you fix it in the same way, it will fall in the same way." And so he gave them, basically they called him to Washington, and all the great minds from Caltech, from Carnegie Tech, from all over the country, from Georgia Tech, from Virginia Tech, sit around a table, and each of them stood up. "I represent Caltech, I represent Georgia Tech, I represent," and von Karman stood up and said, "I represent only the wind." He saw wind as an ally rather than as an enemy. He's the one that made sure he put those diamonds and those little holes in the steel buttress so the wind could go through it, rather than connecting like that. And so I wrote the poem from that point of view. Theodor von Karman, and the idea of giving us the whole term sheer flow. Now, I passed this poem to all the scientists at Caltech to be sure I was right, and they said, "You got it right," because there's a lot of language in here. The Birth of God from an Early Photograph is the title, and I'm just choosing that painting. These are the two gods of Caltech. At first, silence, a gas or two, a wind unchallenged, as if some breath were conspiring to leap a word across oblivion. It was to be a universe of light and sound and calm, ethereal, a way to mirror God's mirage through vanity. But still this wind, its whisper like a protest growing syllables, echoes that would not wane. It was to be a simple creation, an exercise at most of mischief, to play at quirks like building blocks, replenished and diminished. And by its cycle, a god might gain dominion. We would call it nature. But still this wind, a pest, perplexing by some quirk of fate, escaped the boundaries of imagination. And worse, it grew aloof, a mind of its own, filled with thoughts of relative notions. What next? A march, a sit-in, a declaration of rights? By God, there can be no negotiation. Until the wind had found the future willing, it named itself Havoc, and in its wake propelled the span of the galloping Gertie, winding its last ride down Tacoma Narrows. Above the gimbal trust the gods of intellect convened, as if to show what workings of their mind they felt to civilize or redeem. What velocity, what sheer flow, what havoc wombed the gods would overthrow, until in boundless words against the gabled Athenaeum, like some histrion bogarting the mock abyss of sound, a voice, sudden as a quantum leap, spoke the syllable of repair. Wind, I represent only the wind. And havoc swooned a kiss, and an immortal gust of whim married all of gravity to space. And thus had God created human nature, a necessary fiction like turbulence out of runes, so passionate even the good Lord could not presume. To the gods of intellect, nothing contained remained at absolute rest. To man, nothing soared so fickle as wind and out of reach that he wouldn't chase it to the moon. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, right. The one that's popular is always, why do I recite the poems and not read it? I remember even at Carnegie Hall when I read there twice, actually, I remember the people looking at me saying, when is he going to go to the book? But I revise my poems so much. I mean, months, years, sometimes, just to find the poem. Even though I'm doing others in the meantime, but I'm very much into the revision of a poem. But I believed in what T.S. Eliot said. He says, you must never remember a poem, you must relive it. So sometimes when I'm talking the poem to you, I'm actually trying to relive the poem. Every reading then becomes new to me that way. So, yeah, Ladislav. My publisher, from one of my books, Czech and English.
Is there any other country in the world where you would come so often as you come to this country?
No, this is, I was here when I was 16. I got a student Fulbright. I've had 3 professorship Fulbrights. One was to China, Beijing. The other was to Slovenia. And the third one was to Czech Republic. But I had a student Fulbright, and it was to either be a intern at Time magazine or work at a publishing house in Munich. So I did the thinking of math in terms of the mileage from Munich to Bratislava to my villages in Slovakia. And of course I took Munich and stayed there. And from that point on, I was here when I was still 16, 17 years old, up here to see the city. And I remember when we called it communist gray, when all the buildings were grayish from the bituminous coal that was burning during the winter. And then when '89 happened, my God, painted houses, everything, doors that were shuttered were opened up, and there were huge squares in there, like Ungelt. It was always closed. You didn't know that there was that square in there, and many of the others. So, yeah, and I never stopped coming back. I used to go to my villages, and it was a tough time because it was a period of the toughest time of communism, the height of the Cold War. And so those of us who became dissidents here were singled out, and I had twice house arrest, but brief ones. My American passport always saved me. But it didn't havel. He took 4 years in jail and then in and out of other times. So I admired him, yeah.
Forgive me for my ignorance, but I wonder whether you write also in other languages, in addition to English, Czech.
No, I appreciate that, yeah.
Because translation of poetry to other languages is very difficult,
Yeah,
and it has a very different emotion. So I would really appreciate it.
I agree, 100%. I helped to translate and edit Yevtushenko, the Russian poet's collected poems, 700 pages, took 2 years. I know what that process is. And my work is in 16 languages now. I just got a letter from Italy who's going to do my book in Italian. And so I did start writing in Slovak, by the way. That was my first language. We only spoke Slovak at home. So I did write that, and I still remember my mother crying, and I read the poem, The Slovak Mother, it was called. It was actually published in the LA Times on Mother's Weekend. But then I realized nobody else would ever hear it but her, and I should start writing in English. But I must tell you something else. Prejudice is a very difficult thing. That's an understatement to say thing. I was doing an interview in New York, TV interview, and they said, whatever got you into poetry? My God, you were studying pre-med. I actually had a tryout with the New York Yankees. I mean, I went all the way with baseball, because the only way we can go to college, one of 13 children, was to play all 3 sports. So how I got to college was on scholarships, sports. And so she was questioning, how could you get into poetry? And I never had the right answer until that day. And I said, you know, when I was a kid, I remember being in a lot of fights, and I didn't know why. It was only later I realized it was my language, and that those fights kept occurring and occurring. As I started to learn English, because we had Slovak nuns up to 4th grade, and once I started learning English, I began to see language as a matter of survival, communication as a matter of survival, and that the fights were less and less, and that I can win battles with words rather than fists. So as a result of that, yeah, I began to really love languages. And in many cases, at one point, I thought I could speak about 6, what I call taxi Greek. You know, how to get yourself through the city without being taken. But I was able to speak several languages just because. Even in Moscow, it was an amazing moment, because I had to follow Dylan on the podium. Oh, they're loving him. I'm the nobody. And at the last second, I realized, oh my God, я говорю по-русски, I speak Russian. And I got up there and I said such a simple thing. I just said, Moj matka i otec narodzili Slovakia. Evgeny Yevtushenko, he was my translator, interpreter, on narodzil Sibirsky Junction, Sibirsky. Un moj brat, he is my brother. The place went crazy. They were just applauding. The American poet is speaking Russian to us. This was in 1985. Gorbachev was in office only 1 month. The New York Times called me later. Did you know you were part of history that night, the 4 of you? I said, we knew something was different because the government didn't want us to go. And we did. And they said, yeah, that was Gorbachev's first foray into glasnost was that night. 10,000 people in an audience, bringing Americans over with the Russians. But look what Russian did for me. Now, the press only interviewed me from that point on. Everywhere we went, you know, the gauntlet of people were out to get me and Dylan. By the way, Dylan used to always say, it was horrible. John Lennon had just been killed maybe a year earlier. He was so frightened. So these gauntlet of people be waiting for him. And he'd always say, Jim, you go down first and open the car. Well, then after I did it for a while, I went, wait a minute. Go down first? And I would go down, open the car door, and he would come rushing down and get in. I mean, this was a tough time, a period, but still, this was a time when we were doing what we should have been doing, you know, speaking and meeting other writers and other artists, and learning language. Unfortunately, it's the one thing they keep knocking out of curriculum in high school, or languages, or the arts, or that has to change. Education has to be rebuilt more into social sciences. You know, I think you even came up through that area, taught a little bit in that. He was a teacher once, he knows. So in any case, I was proud to be Czechoslovak, and I've been coming here ever since, yeah, like you asked, and saw the changes, was in the middle of it. I remember little things, the documentary they did on my life it's called Flowers and Roots, and it's been on PBS, and it has won now 19 recognitions at different festivals, film festivals. But in it, I talk about the day the librarian at Jumene called me in because apparently my book was on the shelf, and it must have been a cousin or somebody of mine put it there. What is your book doing on the shelf? I said, I don't know. Did you put it there? No, I didn't. I figured it had to be a relative. Well, it can't be here. She pulled it out, took out scissors, and there was a poem to Jan Palach, a poem to Jan Zajec, a poem to Dubček, and another that had to do with the actual invasion of Czechoslovakia, on August 21st. She scissored them out in front of me, threw them into the trash can, and said, now it can remain. And it was, you never saw censorship so graphic in my life. And right now, I have a script. I was just asked to work with the director on it called Havel. There's going to be a film about Havel. They're going to shoot in 2 weeks. And I'm just looking at the script and replaying in my life all of those periods and times that we were trying to just change a culture and a politics of a country because of how the suffering that was going on here, but across Europe as well. Yeah.
If you had not started writing during a period of turmoil, do you think you would have become a poet?
Probably still would have, because my parents, being Slovak, had brought all these books of poetry. We had so much, the music was always, the music of Smetana or Dvorak, and we had that all over the house. It was always the arts. And my brother Andy used to play guitar, and he was on the Ted Mack Amateur Hour, which we used to be the, what they might call American Idol today. We had art in the family. But you learn from your parents. My father, wow. Look, I would have been writing, because when I was a little kid, I remember one of 13 children, my dad coming to me and said, Jimmy, you will sleep on this pillow. This will be your bed. Georgie, you're going to sleep on this pillow. This is going to be your bed. Tommy, this is your pillow. You sleep on here. Now, there were 12 strangers in our house with children, and we were 4 in a bed, and they were going to take our bed. Well, of course we were resenting this as children. We didn't understand. And they took our beds, and over the month, 2 months, of course, we learned to play with them and learned to accept that they were there. And it was only when I went into high school, I think, or even maybe grade school, but high school, when I learned these were 12 Hungarian refugees from the 1956 uprising. My parents, with 13 children, took them in. That said quite a bit about them as parents. And it kept being that way. I came over to a wedding here in the Romas. You're only allowed to have the Roma in your house if they're going to entertain for you. Otherwise, and this was a wedding reception, and my father is distracted. He keeps looking over, and he keeps saying, Pietro, is that you? And the I'll call it gypsy, but the Roma said, yes, John, it is. Come, sit. That was his playmate as a child in the villages. Come, sit. You should have seen the family around the table. Like this. Like that. I caught it, and my dad caught it. He played violin, by the way, my dad. Got up, took his fiddle from him, made him sit in his seat, and he played the fiddle with the band. I was never more proud of my dad than I was that day. And this is what we learned, how to be open, how to bring in, to bring in people who need the most help. And to learn, like Martin Luther King said, community, to relearn that again. Yes?
So you seem to be quite the master of words. So can you remember a moment where you were left speechless?
Where I was left speechless? Where? Okay, I'll tell you where. In China, in Beijing, because I was a Fulbright professor, 13 of us, they blamed us. at the beginning for being responsible for Tiananmen Square, the massacre. Now, here's what I did. They actually took me, my wife, and my 2-year-old child, put us in a car and was driving us out of town and kicked us out of the country. I was not allowed to come back to China for 20 years. Could never go back until they just did my play there about 4 years ago. And they flew me over. And now they're thinking there's going to be a play. My play might be done here in Prague, I hope. But the speechless part was then, I'll never forget how I was crying when I saw the people who were killed in that square, because I took the guilt on. Here's what I did. There was a culture minister. Most people don't know this. There was a culture minister who was very popular. He was not corrupt, whereas Deng Xiaoping and Li Peng, they were all sort of a corrupt octogenarian generation. And they wanted to celebrate him. So I simply said, look, take your guitars, take some poetry, take whatever you want to read down into the square, take some tents and do an old-fashioned sit-in. You know, just go play and do what you can. We had no idea, I had none, that they were going to bring the Minju statue, which is a Statue of Liberty. I don't know if you've seen the picture of it. It's huge, plaster of Paris statue. It then became a political moment. And then everything changed like that. People died. 3,000 people burned. They were burning them at Babashan crematorium. I wrote a poem about that. And that's where the poems, but yes, I was left speechless when I suddenly realized the role I played, unwittingly, in causing June 7th to occur. So many people dying, and, you know. But here it happened too, on 21st of August, 1968. How many young people died here taking on the Russian Warsaw Pact? And you do what you can. For example, I had to read there's a picture of me reading for 6,000 people in Bulgaria, Sofia. And you can remain speechless about the fact that the Warsaw Pact had invaded my country, or you speak and let them know. The Politburo was behind me, large audience, and I read all of the very poems that this woman had cut out of the book. I read every one of them and was giving them hell for invading Czechoslovakia. And when I was done, I turned around. You can see the Politburo looking at me like they would kill me right there. Who invited you? But I did what I needed to do at that moment. This is where poetry does make you speech-worthy, if you want to say it that way. You must be able to respond. There's so much to do. And you do it in your own communities. This is what we did. Those very people that were in our house ended up getting places around that whole neighborhood, and they would bring free food over, everything they could bring over. I used to scream anything to give to us and give to the family as their way to pay back. People have a way of doing that, you know, so. Okay. Yes, Ladislav.
Who arranges your reciting in countries like China?
I just do them. I don't have anybody doing that. I get invitations, and I'm that person who always says yes.
What about Singapore? Have you been to Singapore recently?
No, I have never been there.
Maybe your wonderful poems specify the situation.
Yeah,
Or Hong Kong, sorry, no, sorry.
yeah. But I mean, I've read all over. I read in Rio de Janeiro, I read up in Sweden, I've read all the different countries, 32 ambassadors, 7 heads of state. And, you know, it's not, you don't read for awards or even write for awards. You know, this is why I appreciate all ambassadors, you know, Ambassador King, you know, also Pavel, all of the people who've put themselves out to try to do some good in getting that understanding, to allow it to know its failure. In other words, to let truth and let good prevail. So that's why I appreciate all that we can do in the world. Let's not stop. I'm a very positive, optimistic person. When you have the brothers and sisters I had, you had no other way to be. No, I mean it. It was something.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Who amongst us that travel through an airport and have to wait at the end of our trip for luggage to be disgorged from this track, in this hole in this track? We'll miss that luggage passing in front of us, waiting to see that book. I'm also reminded from Jim's fine words of a story about a Western cowboy in the United States riding his horse on the range when the horse is startled by a rattlesnake and immediately takes off on a wild run and comes to the edge of a canyon, and the horse at the last minute realizes, I must stop, obviously, or I'm going to be over. He slams on the brakes, but the poor cowboy on the horse goes over the top. He's falling down into this vast canyon hole and grasping. And the last minute is able to grasp a little tree twig sticking out the side of this canyon wall. And after he catches his breath, starts screaming out, "Help! Help!" And there's quiet. His voice is echoing through the canyon. "Please, please, is there anybody? God, can you hear me?" And this deep, resonant voice says, "Yes." And the cowboy says, "God, is that you?" "Yes." "Oh, thank you, thank you. Tell me, please, what must I do?" And the voice says, "Let go." And the cowboy says, "Is there anybody else out there?" Thank you very much for your time. Enjoy, we've got some little tidbits and we've got some drinks. So enjoy the rest of your evening here in this beautiful home.